The first stone hit the back of her head. I heard the sound before I saw what made it. A wet, hard crack, like green wood splitting. And I turned in the saddle, and there she was, already on one knee in the mud of the street, one hand up and one hand down, trying to hold herself off the ground. The crowd around her was maybe 30-40 people. Trappers, a couple of soldiers off duty, arms folded. Women from the church. A boy no older than 8 already stooping for another rock, looking at the men beside him to make sure he was doing right. I had ridden into Cutter's Crossing that morning for salt and a new iron pin for the drag pole of my supply sled. Nothing more. I had not come to watch, and I had not come to stop anything. But I knew what I was looking at. She was half-blood. Lakota mother. White father, which meant neither world would claim her when trouble came. Her hair was dark, worn in a single braid down her back the way my people wore it. And her dress was neither one thing nor the other. A mix sewn together by a woman who'd had to choose practical over belonging. She had her head down, and she was not crying. That I noticed first. A woman on her knees in the mud, with blood on the back of her collar, and she was not crying. The second stone went wide. The third hit her shoulder blade, and she dropped flat. I don't know what I said. Something in Lakota, loud enough that the people nearest me stepped back. I put my horse between her and the crowd, and I got down. Let me back up. Let me tell you what I was, that morning, coming into Cutter's Crossing. My name, the name the traders used, was Heron Standing. My own name I will not give you here. It belongs to my people and to a woman who said it to me later in a way I have not forgotten. I was 43 years old, and I had been chief of my band for 11 years, since my uncle died of the spotted fever that came through the valley in the winter of the bad snows. I was not a large man, and I was not a loud one. I had a scar that ran from my left ear down across the jaw, given to me by a Crow raider when I was 19, and it had pulled the corner of my mouth slightly up on that side, so that I looked always like I found something faintly amusing. I did not often find things amusing. I had been married. My wife, Swallow Song, died of a difficult birth 7 years before, and the child with her. I had not looked for another woman after that, not seriously. My band was my work, and my grief was mine to carry, and the two things seemed enough. I did not come into the trading towns often. The treaty had moved us north, away from the river crossings, and I came only when I had to. When the winter was long, or the hunting thin, or we needed iron that we could not make ourselves. The men at Cutter's Crossing knew me by sight. Most of them kept a respectful distance, which was what I wanted. That morning the town was worked up about something. I could feel it before I dismounted. The particular tight energy of people who have already decided something and are waiting to act. I had felt it before in different places, with different crowds. It always looked the same. Men standing in 2s and 3s near the trading post, speaking low, a woman hurrying her children inside. The blacksmith stopped working, leaning in his doorway, watching the street. I bought my salt. I asked about the iron pin. The trader, thick man, named Olt, with yellowed fingernails and a habit of not looking directly at anyone, told me the pin would take an hour. I went back outside, and that is when I heard the first stone hit. I put my horse between her and the crowd. The horse was a gray gelding, 16 hands, and he was trained not to spook at noise. Good horse for the situation. The men in the front of the crowd were uncertain now. Some of them knew me. The others read the ones who knew me, and what they read made them careful. I crouched down beside her. She had turned over onto her side. The cut on the back of her head was bleeding into her braid, slow and dark. Her left eye was swelling where she'd hit the ground. She was looking at me, and her look was not the look of a person who expected help. It was the look of someone cataloging a new danger, trying to decide whether I was better or worse than what she already had. "Can you stand?" I said it in Lakota. Then in the trader's English, which I spoke well enough, she said, "In English, I can stand." She couldn't, not right away. I took her arm and got her up, and she made no sound doing it, though it cost her. A man near the front called out, said she'd stolen from the trading post, said she'd taken a bolt of cloth and a bag of meal, and walked out without paying, said Alt himself had seen it. I looked at Alt, who was in his doorway now. Alt looked at his feet. I have learned over many years, read the men who look at their feet. I did not make a speech. I have never been a man for speeches in a crisis. Words take too long, and the space between words is where things go wrong. I put her up on my gray, and I got up behind her and I turned the horse, and I walked out of Cutter's, crossing at a walking pace, not a run, and nobody stopped me. I heard the murmuring behind us, heard one man say something hard and ugly, heard another man laugh at him, which told me enough about how things stood. We rode north. She did not speak for a long time. Posture was stiff. Not from fear, I thought, but from the effort of sitting upright without leaning back against me, without accepting what she hadn't asked for. I understood that. Pride, that's all you've got left. You hold it with both hands. After a mile or so, I said, "You don't have to hold yourself like that." "I'm not going to hurt you," she said. "I don't know that." "No," I said. "Don't." We rode another half-mile. She let herself lean back just a little. Not much. Enough. Her name was Marguerite Falls Far. Mother had been Lakota, from a band that wintered in the Platte River breaks, Fee, and her father had been a French trapper who came through one season and didn't come back. She'd been raised in the in-between. Too Lakota for the white settlements, too white for the bands that would have taken her in. She was 31 years old. She had been staying in a borrowed room above the feed store in Cutter's Crossing for 2 months as a laundress for the soldiers' wives at the small garrison outside town. She told me some of this that first night. Not all of it. The rest came out over weeks, the way things do when a person has spent a long time being careful about what they say and to whom. We made camp about 6 miles north of Cutter's Crossing in a copse of cottonwood along a creek that I knew well. I built a fire, and I looked at the cut on her head. It needed to be cleaned, and it needed to be closed. I had a kit in my saddlebag. I always carried one for the band. Bone needle, sinew, a small clay jar of the drawing salve my grandmother had taught me to make from yarrow and tallow. I told her what I needed to do. She said, "Go ahead." I closed the cut, 4 stitches. She watched the fire while I worked, and she kept her hands flat on her thighs. I could feel the tension in her. Not fear exactly, more like the tension of a person who has learned not to flinch because flinching only makes things worse. When I was done, she said, "Thank you," not the thank you of relief. The thank you of someone making an accounting, receiving a thing, noting it down, understanding that a debt existed. That kind of thank you. I gave her jerked meat and cornbread from my pack. She ate carefully, not like she wasn't hungry. She was hungry, I could see it. But like she was watching how much she took, keeping it modest. Old habit. The habit of a person who has eaten at other people's fires, often enough to know the rules. I said, "Did you take the cloth and the meal?" She looked at me, long moment. "No," she said. "Alt wanted me to go with him. I wouldn't. The theft was his way of making me pay for that." I nodded. The way Alt had looked at his feet had said as much. She said, "Why did you stop?" I thought about it. The real answer was complicated, and I wasn't sure I had words for all of it. What came out was, because nobody else was going to. She looked at the fire for a while after that. "Where are you taking me?" she said. "North," I said. "Our winter camp is in the valley below Black Knife Ridge. 12 families. I am chief of this band." "And what am I, in your winter camp?" "That depends on you," I said. I should tell you something about my band, so you understand what I was bringing her into. We were not a large band. 12 families, which was maybe 60 people when you counted the children and the old ones. We had come through bad years. The treaty that pushed us north, the fever that took my uncle and 8 others, the 2 winters in a row when the buffalo were thin and we had to move twice to find enough. We were still here, still whole, but we had worked for it. And the people who were still with me had worked hard, and they did not easily welcome strangers. There was also the matter of who she was. Half-blood was a word the white soldiers used. My people had their own understanding of it. Not cruel, exactly, but complicated. A woman who belonged to both worlds and was claimed by neither was a kind of problem, an unanswered question, and unanswered questions make people cautious. I knew this when I brought her in. I also knew that I was the chief, and what I sanctioned, people lived with. We reached the winter camp on the third day of riding. It sat in the valley below Black Knife Ridge, ran east to west like a crooked spine, and held the worst of the north wind off the lodges. It was a good camp, sheltered, close to water, with enough timber nearby for fires that would last the winter. I had found this valley 12 years before, when I was still learning to be what my uncle needed me to be, and I had brought the band here every winter since. The people came out to meet us. Marguerite rode in beside me. I had given her the gray and walked the last mile, and the people looked at her, and then at me, and nobody said anything yet, because that is how it works. The chief arrives, the chief speaks, then people say what they think. I spoke plainly. I told them what had happened in Cutter's Crossing. I told them she was wrongly accused. I told them she had her mother's blood, and that the in-between was not a crime. I told them she would stay with us through the winter, and that she would work and carry her weight, and that I expected her to be treated accordingly. An older woman named Dried Berry. She was 60-something, sharp as a blade, and had been with the band longer than I'd been alive. Looked at Marguerite for a long moment, and then made a sound that could have been approval or could have been the start of an argument. With Dried Berry, it was sometimes hard to tell. Then she waved her hand at the closest lodge and said, in Lakota, "Well, she can sleep in the widow's shelter until we sort something out." That was Dried Berry's version of welcome. The first weeks were not easy. Marguerite was not a woman who asked for ease. She woke before the other women, and she worked hard all day, and she was careful, always, to take a little less than she needed and give a little more than was asked. I watched this without seeming to watch it, the way a chief do. The careful peripheral attention that isn't surveillance, but is a kind of stewardship. She was learning, fast. Her Lakota was partial. She'd grown up hearing it, so the words were in her somewhere. But she was pulling them back out by main force, spending evenings with Dried Berry, who had the patience of a woman, who understood that teaching was its own form of power. She knew plants. That was the first thing she offered the band. The thing that cracked the wariness a little. The third day she was there, she went out with two of the younger women to find firewood, and she came back with the firewood and also a bundle of dried stalks that I recognized, as the same plant my grandmother had used in the drawing salve. She cleaned them and prepared them and brought them to me without a word, set them down outside my lodge in a neat bundle. I stood there looking at them for a minute. Then I said in English, "You know what those are," she said. My mother knew them. She taught me. That was the first time she offered something of herself. Not her labor. She'd been offering since day one, but something that was hers. Her mother's knowledge, her mother's line. Let me tell you about a morning in November, about 6 weeks after she arrived. I was up before first light, which I usually was. The cold had come in earnest. The kind that settles into the ground and stays. That makes the horse's breath hang in white clouds and turns the mud to iron underfoot. I had gone to check on the horses, which I did every morning, and on my way back through the camp, I passed the widow's shelter where Marguerite slept. The fire inside was low. I could see through the smoke hole that it had burned down to coals. I stopped, thought about it, went to the wood stack, took an armful, went inside. She was awake, sitting up in her blankets, watching me come in with the wood. I built the fire up without saying anything. It's not a complicated job, but it takes attention. The way you lay the kindling, the angle, giving it air. When it caught and held, I sat back and looked at it. She said, "You don't have to do that," I said. The fire was low. I would have woken soon and built it up myself. "Yes," I said, but I was already up. We sat there with the new fire going. Tss. Outside the camp was starting to stir. I could hear it, the sounds a camp makes when it wakes, particular rhythm of my people beginning their day. She said, "Do you miss her?" I looked at her. She hadn't asked it before. She was looking at the fire, not at me, giving me room to not answer if I didn't want to. "Every day," I said. She nodded. "I'm sorry," she said. Just that. Not sorry about anything in particular. Not sorry in a way that required a response. The sorry of one person recognizing the weight another person carries. I stayed until the fire was fully established, and then I went back to my lodge. But I thought about that exchange for a long time after. The winter deepened. The hunting was harder than I'd hoped. Not terrible, thin. And there were decisions to make about how far to range and when to move the horses to the lower pasture, and how to stretch what we had. These were the decisions of a chief. I had made them for 11 years, and I made them again, the same way I always did. By thinking it through, by listening to the people who knew the most about each piece of the problem, by deciding and holding the decision. Marguerite watched this. She was not a woman who inserted herself where she hadn't been invited, but she was always paying attention, and there was a quality to her attention. A particular steadiness that I noticed. She asked good questions when she asked them. She remembered what she was told. By midwinter, Dried Berry had stopped calling her the half-blood woman and started calling her the one who knows plants, which, for Dried Berry, was practically a declaration of kinship. One of the young men in the band, a 20-year-old, named Runs Ahead, with considerable confidence in his own charm, tried his luck with her twice. She let him down both times in a way that was firm, without being cruel, and that somehow ended with him, feeling that declining him had been a generous act on her part. I watched this also. She had a quality, a kind of contained dignity, that held people at the distance she wanted them at. Wondered. Sometimes, whether that distance was for everyone. I did not ask. The thing that changed the real hinge of it was in February, deep of winter. One of my men, a quiet, capable man named Catches the Wind who had been with the band since before I was chief, came back from a scouting ride with a bad fever. He'd been caught in a freezing rain 2 nights out and had pushed through it and come home with his teeth chattering and a look in his eyes that said the sickness was already in him deep. His wife was frightened. His children were frightened. I was not frightened. I'd seen this sickness before, and I knew it was serious but manageable if you managed it right. But the camp was tight with worry, the way it gets when one of the core people is down. Marguerite went to work. I don't mean she offered. I mean she was simply there, at Catches the Wind's fire, with her plant bundle and her knowledge, and a particular focused calm that I had not seen in her before. Rather, I had seen it, but not this fully. She prepared a tea from the yarrow, and something else I didn't recognize, a root she'd found in the fall and dried. She made a poultice for his chest. She sat up with his wife through the first night, and when his fever spiked in the small hours she was ready for it. Already awake, already working. I was there, too, through parts of that night. It's Chief's place to be present when one of his people is seriously ill. I sat near the door, out of her way, and I watched her work. There was a moment, maybe the 3rd hour of night, when the fever was at its worst, and Catches the Wind was shaking hard and his wife was gripping his hand, and Marguerite was on her knees beside him, with her hands moving through the things she needed, and she said, quietly, in Lakota, to him, something I had heard my grandmother say to sick people. An old phrase. Not a prayer exactly, more a kind of reassurance, a way of telling the body that it was seen and that help was here. She hadn't been taught that phrase by Dried Berry. She'd gotten it from her mother, 30 years ago, and she'd held on to it. I looked at the wall of the lodge for a while after that. Catches the Wind's fever broke by morning. He was weak for 2 weeks, but he came through. His wife, when she could speak about it, said Marguerite had saved him. I think that was true enough. After that, the camp was different with her. Nothing announced, nothing declared, just different. The way people spoke to her, The way they included her in the small daily negotiations of a winter camp. Dried berries started sitting with her in the evenings, two of them working on something with their hands. I could never quite see what, and talking in low voices. I found reasons to be near her. I didn't examine this closely. I was 43 years old, and I had been alone for 7 years, and I had gotten used to that, and I had decided, somewhere in those 7 years, that being used to it was the same as being finished with the other possibility. I was not sure, now, that those two things were the same. I taught her to track. That sounds like a small thing, but it isn't. It's a language, reading the ground, and not everyone can learn it. She could. She had the patience for the close work, the ability to hold still and look longer than she thought she needed to, and after a few weeks, she was reading deer sign that I would have been pleased to read at her age. We were out in the timber one afternoon in late February, following a set of tracks in the snow, and she was ahead of me and she stopped and went very still and held up one hand. I stopped. 30 yards ahead, between two spruce trees, a bull elk was standing in a shaft of pale winter light. Massive animal, 8-point rack, looking away from us. We were downwind. He didn't know we were there. We stood like that for a long time. Neither of us needed to do anything. The elk moved on eventually, unhurried, and we stood there in his wake in the broken-down snow. She turned and looked at me. There was something in her face, not quite a smile, more than a look. The particular expression of someone who has just been given something they didn't know they needed. I said quietly. "Good eye," she said, equally quietly. "Thank you for teaching me." We stood in the elk's clearing a while longer, in the snow, in the thin February light. I'm going to tell you about the night I said something that had been building all winter. That's the part of the story you've been waiting for, and I've been circling it long enough. It was March. The worst of winter was breaking. The light was coming back, and you could feel the ground softening in the afternoons. That particular smell of cold earth, starting to think about spring. The horses were restless. The young men were restless. The whole camp had the tense, jittery energy of something that has been compressed all winter and is beginning to expand again. I had been sitting outside my lodge in the last of the evening light, thinking about the hunting, about the spring move, about the things a chief thinks about when the season turns. Marguerite came by with water from the creek. She'd taken over the evening water, carrying for dried berry, who'd had a bad knee since December, and she stopped. She said, "You have the look you get when there are too many things to hold." I looked at her. "What look is that?" I said. "Like, you're carrying something heavy, and you're not going to put it down, but you're also not going to pretend it isn't heavy." I thought about that. "Sit down," I said. She set down the water and sat. Not close, not far. The fire between us and the last of the daylight, going orange over the ridge. I said, "When the snow clears, I'm going to Cutter's Crossing," she said. "For Alt." "For Alt," I said. I wanted Alt to account for what he'd done. Not blood. That was not what I was thinking, despite what some men would have done, but account. His lie told to a crowd with rocks in their hands. A wrong that had been done in the open needed to be addressed in the open. That was how I understood justice. She was quiet for a bit. "You don't have to do that for me," she said. "I know," I said. "Then why?" I looked at the fire. I have never been a man who talks around things. But I have also never been a man who talks before he's ready. And I was not entirely ready. But I said it anyway. "Because you are one of my people now," I said. "And what was done to one of my people was done wrong. And I do not let that stand." She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said very quietly, "I haven't been one of anyone's people in a long time." "I know," I said. "I've been watching." She turned and looked at me then. Not the cataloging look she'd given me that first day in the mud of Cutter's Crossing. The look that was deciding whether I was better or worse than what she already had. Something else. Something that had worked its way past the careful distances she kept. I held her look. She said, "What happens after Cutter's Crossing?" I said, "That depends on what you want." She said, What do you want? This is the moment I have thought about since. The moment I want to tell you about, more than any of the other moments, because it is the one where I understood something about myself that I had spent 7 years not understanding. I said, I want you to stay. Not tentatively. Not as a question wrapped up in the shape of a statement, the way some men say things to give themselves room to retreat if the answer is wrong. I said it the way I'd made 12 years of decisions. Clearly, having thought it through, holding it. She sat with that for a moment. Outside, the camp was settling into evening. Someone's fire smelled of pine. One of the children laughed somewhere. A bright sudden sound. She said, I think I want that too. She reached out and put her hand over mine, where it rested on my knee. Just held it. Her hand was warm and strong and rough from the winter's work. I turned my hand over and held hers back. We sat like that until the fire needed tending. I went to Cutter's Crossing in late March, 4 of my men. We were not going for war. I want to be clear about that. We were going to have a plain conversation in public, where the same people who had watched the stoning would hear it. Alt was in his trading post when we arrived. I walked in and I was alone. My men stayed outside, which was deliberate, a statement. And I told Alt, in English, Marguerite Falls Far had not stolen from him, and that the whole town of Cutter's Crossing knew it. I told him that his lie had come close to killing a woman, and that I held him responsible for that. I told him that if anything happened to her, ever, any reason that smelled like his doing, I would know about it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten with anything specific. I just stood there and told him the truth plainly, in full view of 3 other customers in the store and the trader's assistant, and 2 soldiers who come in for tobacco. Alt said nothing for most of it. Then he said, in a smaller voice than he usually had, She's with you now then. She is, I said. He looked at the counter. I walked out. The garrison commander at Cutter's Crossing was a man named Whitfield, who I had dealt with for years, in the negotiated, wary civility that was the best white officers and Lakota chiefs usually managed. I found him before I left town and I told him the same thing, more briefly. He was the kind of man who valued order over everything else, and a Lakota chief making a clear claim was, in its way, a kind of order he could understand. Whitfield said, I'll see to it, the record is corrected. I said, see to it, we rode home. Spring came the way it does after a hard winter, fast and committed like it had somewhere to be. The valley went from white to brown to the first impossible green in what felt like 2 weeks. The horses were turned out to the new grass, and you could watch them thinking about how good that was. The children were everywhere, underfoot, drunk on the warmth. Marguerite and I were not yet what I would have called together, not in the way the band would recognize and sanction. That was a process, a conversation that involved my band and my responsibilities in some ceremony, and it was not something I wanted to rush or do carelessly. She understood this. She was patient, in a way that was not passive. It was the patience of a woman who knew her own worth and wasn't going anywhere. But we walked the valley together in the evenings. We talked, we argued sometimes, which I had not expected, and which I found, to my surprise, that I respected. She had a mind that pushed back, that did not soften itself to agree with me when it didn't, and I was not the chief she was talking to in those moments. I was just the man, and she was just the woman. And the arguments were the arguments of 2 people learning the shape of each other. One evening we were sitting above the camp on the spine of a low hill, watching the valley go gold in the late light, and she said, Tell me about Swallow Song. I looked at her, she said. You don't have to, but I want to know who she was. So I told her. Not everything. Some things are held close and should be, but enough. Swallow Song's laugh. The way she'd moved through the camp, quick and sure. The morning I found out she was gone. The 7 years after. Marguerite listened without filling in the silences with anything. When I was done, she was quiet for a bit, and then she said, She sounds like someone worth grieving. She was, I said. Good, she said. A man who knows how to grieve right knows how to love right. I sat with that. After a while I said, "Your father, do you know where he went?" She looked at the valley. "North," she said. That's all my mother ever said. He went north. Small pause. I stopped wondering about it a long time ago. That's not nothing, I said. Stopping wondering about something. That takes work. She looked at me. Half smile. You sound like Dried Berry. Dried Berry is smarter than I am, I said. I've known that for 20 years, she laughed. It was the first time I'd heard her really laugh. Not the small, careful sounds she'd been making all winter, but an actual laugh, easy and unself-conscious. It changed her whole face, I thought. There it is. There's what was underneath all that careful distance. I was very glad, then, that I had turned my horse around in Cutter's Crossing. The ceremony was in May, when the band was fully into its spring life, and there was food and warmth, and the feeling of a people who had come through something and were glad to be on the other side of it. I won't tell you all of it. Some of it is not mine to give. But I'll tell you what I remember best. We were standing in front of the whole band. Dried Berry presiding. She had earned that right. She had been the elder who knew the old forms. And she said something to the camp about who this woman was, and how she'd come among us, and what she'd given, and what she'd shown herself to be. Then she looked at Marguerite and she said, in Lakota, slow enough that every word landed, "You came to us from nowhere. You showed yourself. This band has decided you are from here now. From here. Not from somewhere else. To stay. From here." Marguerite's face did not break apart. She was not that kind of woman. But something in it shifted. Something deep, like a thing that had been braced for a long time, finally allowed itself to ease. She looked at me. I held her eyes. I was in that moment, the center of something. My band around me, this woman in front of me, this life that I had built over hard years. The man they all leaned on. The man who had ridden out into that street on a morning in September for no reason. He could have explained cleanly and come back with this. I reached out and took her hand. She gripped it, her fingers around mine, firm. Dried Berry made a sound that was definitely approval this time. That was 22 years ago. We have 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. My sons are grown and have their own responsibilities. My daughter has her mother's eyes. God help us, her mother's stubbornness. And she knows the plants the way Marguerite knows them, and someday she will know more. I am 65 years old. The scar on my jaw has faded some. The corner of my mouth still pulls up on that side, so I still look faintly amused. I am still mostly not amused, but more often than I used to be. The band has changed. The world has changed around us in ways I will not get into here because they are heavy, and this is not the story for that weight. We are still here, still whole. That is the work. That has always been the work. Marguerite is sitting outside as I tell you this. We have a place in the valley now, above the winter camp, with a view of the ridge. She is doing something with her hands. The plants, probably. There is always something she is doing with the plants. And the evening light is on her. And she is 61 years old. And she is right now the most settled and complete thing in my line of sight. I think about that morning in Cutter's Crossing sometimes. The first stone, the sound of it, the 30 seconds between that sound and me turning my horse. If I had not turned. If I had ridden on with my salt and my iron pin and my reasons and my grief, but I turned. And she looked at me with those cataloging eyes and decided I was worth the risk of accepting help from. I turned, and she held on. That's all. That's the whole of it.